Today, is the Postal Bank winning? Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, one latest post covering finance and property news. I'm joined by Robbie Barwick from the Citizens Party. Hi, Robbie.
Hi, Martin.
Great to have you on the show, and a very important conversation this. We've been pushing quite hard for the Postal Bank, and the good news is things are moving in the right direction.
Absolutely. So we've got want to bring your viewers up to speed with quite a big breakthrough in the last few weeks on this campaign, and that is that a couple of weeks ago, the Australian newspaper headline was that the Labor has put the Postal Bank back on the agenda. And by back on the agenda, it actually referred to the fact that in 2019, in the 2019 election, Bill Shorten, who was the leader of Labor at that time, actually did intend to adopt a postal bank if he got elected. But he lost the election and the policy was dropped. And so I know about that case. We have been pushing this policy relentlessly since 2020. So this is for us and our party 4 years in the making, and you've been there from the very beginning. When you and I first started talking, Martin, we found ourselves in agreement on our concern on bail-in, our support for Glass-Steagall banking separation, and we had a campaign on that, but also fundamentally our support for a national bank, bringing back a government bank that can do the sort of more important investment jobs in the economy for things that benefited the people and infrastructure and industry, etc., that the private banks don't want to do. And in 2020, it became clear that the most achievable way to do that against all the political opposition that we knew we're up against was the post bank model. Because here you got something that killed two birds with one stone. You got post offices that are there. There's over 4,200 of them in Australia. They're the best retail footprint in the country, and they already provide financial services, but they're going out of business. And Australia Post is going backwards. It's making losses. But if you combine, like a bunch of other countries have done, postal services with banking services in the form of a government bank, the revenue from the banking can help support the postal network, which is a crucial and essential service. The postal network's existing infrastructure supports the banking service, so it can be an essential service. And you've got a practical bank that serves the public, but it can also do the powerful things that a government bank can do. And so once we sort of settled on that model and began pushing it, and we've been pushing it relentlessly, we came up against all the opposition we thought we would, but we've slowly worn them down. And the big breakthrough was a combination of things. The regional bank closures inquiry, which became a very big inquiry, very successful inquiry, but you and I conspired to get this inquiry up, and we worked with some other people, such as the independent journalist Dale Webster, the now independent or People's First Senator Gerard Rennick. He was really crucial. He was in on the conspiracy, for want of a better word, to actually let's get an inquiry that can highlight this crisis in branch closures in the regions, but in doing so, put forward the solution of a public bank. And that worked. Our party was able to testify before the inquiry. The inquiry handed down its report a few months ago, and the second recommendation of that report was that the government should set up an expert panel to look at this public postal bank solution to the problem. So we were thrilled about that. And the other thing that we understand has moved the government is the crisis in cash distribution across Australia. We've now only got one major cash in transit company, Armaguard, and it's a monopoly. And the banks have caused this problem, but they're in talks with the government and Australia Post, etc., about how do we make sure that the cash keeps flowing, because despite all the demonisation of cash and all the things that banks have done to make cash scarce, The government definitely realises that Australia cannot function without cash, especially regional Australia. So this was another reason the government thought, well, we better look at this. And someone that you and I both know, who we won't name, has actually had a conversation with a government minister who has confirmed what the Australian newspaper reported, which is that for those reasons, the government is definitely looking at this option and is in discussion to start it. So we've won the argument for the bank, I feel, right? After 4 years of intense, relentless campaigning, we've won the argument for the bank. Now we've got to shape the discussion so we get the best possible bank we can.
Well, that's good news. And just to underscore, of course, this is about making sure that people can have access to banking services where they live, whether they're in regional areas or whether they're in suburban areas. But also more broadly, it can become a foundation for doing the things that the old CBA did before it was privatised. Yep. Because there is a critical question about how the nature of the economy in Australia is going to evolve, and the neoliberal philosophy of getting out of the business is just completely broken the Australian economy. And so it's critical that we get this idea of a public bank that can do the things that need to be done to build the economy for the people of Australia. And that's what this is about. So it's critical that we continue to push. In terms of the next steps in the campaign, what are those going to be, Robbie?
Martin, there's two videos I think people should watch. One is LPO Group, the Licensed Post Office Group, which represents the small business licensees who run 2/3 of Australia's postal network. They are massive supporters of the Postal Bank. And a few weeks ago, they made a video, just a 90-second video on what the benefits of a postal bank would be. And it's a beautiful little video.
Hi. Thanks very much. At LPA Group, we know that local communities thrive when they're connected. That's why we're advocating for creating an Australian postal bank. By adding full-service banking to our post offices, we'll ensure essential banking services are available in over 4,200 communities across Australia. What do you think of the Northern Territory, Terry?
Thanks, Scott. With this postal bank, we're not just bringing back banking, we're generating the funding needed to keep the Australia Post community post office network strong and viable. What do Queenslanders think, Emmerich?
Our community needs reliable, accessible services. A local bank branch means more than transactions. It means local businesses thrive, families are supported, and connections stay strong. Let's hear from South Australia, did we?
For 4,200 towns and suburbs, this will provide stability and a foundation for the future. It's about keeping these communities alive and vibrant for the long term. What about in Tasmania, Kelly?
An Australian postal bank isn't just an idea, it's a solution to strengthen communities, reconnect banking services, and safeguard the future of the community post office network.
Together, we can build stronger, more connected communities, starting with the Australian Postal Bank.
The other video, Martin, which I think is really worth watching, is one of the senators who participated in the inquiry who really went all out to make the postal bank the issue as the solution was Senator Malcolm Roberts from One Nation. And 2 weeks ago in Parliament, he gave a 5-minute speech about this announcement of the postal bank. And I think his speech was particularly good. And towards the end, he actually elaborates on what a postal bank could be, right? So if we listen to that, you'll actually get a bit of a sense of it.
Senator Roberts.
Thank you. The Australian newspaper reported on the 29th of August that, quote, a government-owned bank created out of Australia Post is understood to be back on the Labor government's agenda, which is seen as a response to the closure of numerous bank branches in regional Australia. End of quote. I hope this report is well-founded, and if it is, I applaud the government for this welcome development. Years of regulation have failed to force the banks to behave with honesty, decency and compassion. More regulation is not the answer. Big banks will always have better lawyers than has the government. The answer is a people's bank offering competition to the Big Four bank oligopoly, or more accurately, cartel. As someone who participated in the inquiry into bank closures in regional Australia, I attest there's a desperate need for a public bank to revolutionise Australia's banking system, the way the original Commonwealth Bank did, and that the Fisher Labor government established in 1912. Today, the Big Four cartel controls 80% of the market and dominates banking. They're acting together to remove face-to-face banking, which doesn't stop customers from needing face-to-face services. It just forces customers to travel further. And not just in the regions. It's as difficult for the elderly in the city to travel to the next suburb for their banking as a regional customer to travel to the next town. We saw numerous instances of the bank's dishonesty when closing branches, and we're seeing it again right now with ANZ's closure of its Katoomba branch. The ANZ treated Katoomba as a regional branch until it promised to not close the regional branches as a condition of its merger with Suncorp Bank. Lo and behold, suddenly ANZ claims Katoomba is not a regional branch, so it's proceeding to close it. The Big Four have concentrated close to 70% of their lending into residential and investor mortgages, with more money fueling the increase in house prices while neglecting the small business lending and regional communities. All four are aggressively pushing customers away from cash and into digital banking and transacting so they can surveil and harvest your data and collect fees on all non-cash transactions. They now gouge Australians more than $4 billion per year in transaction fees and surcharges. In short, the Big Four serve only themselves and use their oligopoly power over a captive market to exploit their customers. There's a dire need for a public bank that can set standards of service and break up the banking cartel. A post office bank is the perfect way to do it, operating under a modified banking code of practice to restore protections to customers that successive Liberal national governments have removed. Guaranteeing cash and banking services, face-to-face banking in a branch, best interests of the customer and protections against politicisation of banking. The Commonwealth Bank originally started in post offices in 1912, from which it provided banking services to all parts of Australia, even remote areas. It raised loans for the government at 1/10 the cost of the private banks. In the panic of 1914, it protected deposits in all the banks. It supported Australia's agricultural production in World War I and funded the emergency purchase of a fleet of ships in the war, which became Australia's first national shipping line. It made development loans to local councils all across Australia for crucial infrastructure, and it made affordable housing loans to returned soldiers. It accomplished all of this in its first decade before its political enemies reduced its ability to compete with the private banks. Until later, another Labor government unleashed it again in World War II. Public and post banks are very successful around the world. The Japan Post Bank is one of the world's biggest banks and was the secret to Japan's post-war economic miracle, funding the government's investments in infrastructure and industries. France's Post Bank, La Banque Postale, started in 2006 and is already Europe's 18th biggest bank and the biggest lender to local councils in France. Kiwi Bank started as a post bank in 2002, quickly growing into New Zealand's 5th largest bank and the only bank that can compete with New Zealand's Big Four banks that Australia's Big Four banks own. Its first achievement was injecting competition which stopped all branch closures in New Zealand for 7 years. In the global financial crisis, Kiwi Bank was the only bank to increase lending while the private banks all reduced lending. And listen to this, the Bank of North Dakota, not a postal bank, a brilliant state-owned bank, for more than a century it supported North Dakota's public finances and its farmers, making a profit in every year of operation. In the 2008 financial crisis, North Dakota was the only United States state to stay out of crisis. I applaud the news that the government is in talks with Australia Post on this solution, and I urge the government to have the vision to create a powerful bank that can once again serve the people of Australia.
To me, what we have to do now is win the argument for the kind of bank it is. If we've won, so we have to find out more, right? But this is, the reason the Australian newspaper reported that a few weeks ago is the government planted that article, and now a minister has confirmed it. So we know we've achieved something really big here, but the government has a whole spectrum of options before it. It could just do something token to get the public off its back, some little tiny institution that tends to work mainly in regional towns and does a few things the other banks won't do, and maybe a little bit of lending, who knows. It could just do something really token, just think quite small, or it could do anything from that to something as big and powerful as the Commonwealth Bank in World War II. I mean, the sky is really the limit of what the government can do. The model, I think, for what the historical model of what might be possible is the way the Commonwealth Bank started in 1912, which also started as a postal bank, by the way. And when it started, it wasn't exactly what the people like King O'Malley in the Labor Party who had pushed for it wanted. They wanted something much more powerful. But because it started in 1912, its managing director was a particularly effective person, a real genius, really. His name was Denison Miller. And he'd been brought in from the Bank of New South Wales, which is now Westpac. So he was made managing director. The first thing he did was he announced that the bank had been given the right under legislation to issue debentures, which is a special form of bond to raise capital. He didn't bother with that. He said to his staff, we're starting this without capital because essentially we're a government bank. That means our capital is the full wealth of Australia, right? And we're backed by that. The government of Tasmania had made a decision. They saw the Commonwealth Bank start, and they realised they thought it would be better for our state bank, which is a small state bank because Tasmania is a small state, to be part of this bigger government bank. And they rolled the state bank's operations in with the Commonwealth Bank. So the Commonwealth Bank started with a whole heap of deposits, mainly Tasmanian deposits. And they just started lending them out. They just got the ball rolling straight away from the first day. That's not what made the reputation of the bank, though. If you're a student of history, there was a financial panic in 1914 on the eve of World War I, and it was really serious. There was a serious panic. A lot of banks in London failed. A lot of banks in Australia were in danger of failing. Denison Miller, this really effective manager of the brand new Commonwealth Bank, but he did a couple of things. He stopped bank runs in Australia for all banks. He actually put out an announcement saying the Commonwealth Bank stands behind all the banks. And so there was no panic in Australia. People didn't run to all the banks and get their money out. And so this one bank saved the existing banks as well as its own deposits. He also was the only bank in the London branch of Australia's Commonwealth Bank was the only bank to not even close down for emergency reasons during that panic. It kept its doors open the whole time. And that really made the reputation of the bank. And then in the war, everything that was needed, because the war is one of those times when there's less rules are involved, right? People can't really quibble. There were all these things that were needed, and he just said, let's do it. So, for instance, Australia had a problem with, we provided goods, agriculture goods, etc., to London, and London was in the middle of fighting the war, but there was no ships. There were no ships available for us to ship it. So our Prime Minister was over in London, and he thought he saw there was something like 17 ships that were for sale. So he sent a telegram to the head of the Commonwealth Bank, which is essentially just a postal bank, a government postal bank. And he said to Denison Miller, can we buy these ships? And Miller said, no problem. And he wired in the money straight away. And this had to be a secretive deal because they didn't want anyone else knowing they were buying the ships. They didn't want them bought out from under them. Bought the ships. That purchase of those ships went on to become Australia's first national shipping line. Things like that happened really fast, on the spot, bang, made it happen. Then existing banks and international banks couldn't finance Australia's production, so the Commonwealth Bank stepped in and financed the production. It financed a lot of local councils needed money for infrastructure. The Commonwealth Bank said, "Well, we'll lend it to you." The first big power plant in Newcastle was built with money borrowed from the Commonwealth Bank. And that allowed Newcastle to go on to become the steel capital of Australia and things like that, right? This was what was essentially a postal bank did all of that. And so why can't we do that again? That is an option the government has available to it right now if it wanted to do that. Just think big. So we're going to be telling the government the history. We're going to be telling the government what the postal bank models are around the world. Japan Post Bank is one of the biggest banks in the world. It is a wholesale type bank. People it doesn't lend to the public. It takes in the public's deposits, just like the original British Postal Bank that William Gladstone set up in the 1860s. It takes the public's deposits, but then it becomes a lender to the government. And it's a cheap source of finance for the government and reliable savings for the public. So you could do something like that. Or France's La Banque Postale started in 2005. It's already the 17th largest bank in Europe. It's the biggest lender to local government in France. That option is available to it. Kiwi Bank started in 2002. Straight away, as a postal bank, straight away it had a direct impact on the banks because they stopped closing branches for the next 7 years. One feature of Kiwi Bank is in the global financial crisis, Martin, in 2008, all of the New Zealand banks stopped lending money. Kiwi Bank, well, they lent less money. They drew back on lending. Kiwi Bank increased its lending and helped get the New Zealand economy through the 2008 global financial crisis. So what we want is the government, as Malcolm Roberts called for in his speech, to have vision. That's going to be key. So we need to shape that discussion, and hopefully we can get something that's quite significant. That said, I'm philosophical, because even if the government is timid, as long as it's a foot in the door, because if it's a foot in the door, it can be opened bigger and bigger and bigger. The Commonwealth Bank kept evolving into something very big. And by World War II, it was a very powerful national bank. So as long as it can do that, because the foot in the door means we have defeated the ideological opposition that all sides of politics had for 30 years to any government involvement in banking. And that really just smashed the Australian economy, that ideological opposition. This means we've finally defeated it. So whatever we get, whether it starts big or small, we'll make it work somehow.
Well, Robbie, that's good to get that perspective. And, the news is good, but we need to keep pushing. And so, if you want to engage with your local politicians, give them a continued push. The more we can push this in the right direction, the better it will be. And as you say, even if we get the foot in the door with something small initially, it has a growth potential later. But we know that the banking system has not worked for ordinary Australians and ordinary businesses for the last 30 years plus. So we need a different model.
This victory is a testament to people power, and not just people power in just a purely populist way, public engagement. The regular viewers of your show, Martin, will detect the theme. We're always telling people, be engaged in the process, right? And this has worked. And this is the victory of this little group. It's a Citizens Party. It's your channel. It's LPO group. There's a small group of individuals and groups that have actually fought for this. We have done this, right? We have pushed the government to adopt a policy that they weren't going to adopt. That's worked. And now we have to use the same process to keep the discussion going so we get the best possible bank. And we'll keep updating people on various things that they can do to help with that process. Right now, if you participate in this campaign, give yourself a pat in the back and stay tuned for more marching orders. One thing you can do, if you go to your local post office, when you go to the local post office, they're running a petition at the moment that you should be able to sign. Which is calling for more services for post offices. Make sure you always stay on top of what's happening on the post office front, because those local post offices have been in trouble. But as that video shows, they know that this is a solution, right? And so the fact that it's something that kills two birds with one stone in terms of solving problems is one of the best things going for this idea. And you can, apart from staying tuned, the updates on this channel and on the Citizens Party channel, keep an eye on what's happening at your local post office, talk to your licensee, and express your support at that level, and that'll encourage them to keep fighting the way they've been fighting as well.
Well, Robbie, thank you very much for the update. Really appreciate it. I think we should get you back on for a live show in 2 or 3 weeks' time, and we can explore that further and continue to push. But good news. Thank you very much for bringing it to us today. And we'll keep the fight going, because this is really important for the future of Australia.
Absolutely. Thanks, Martin.
Cheers.